Welcome to the College Casual Show. First ever episode of the show and first episode of the season. We are in the month of August, which is the start of college football season. Ooh, exciting times for the sport, especially in a new world of college football, a new landscape, really, to kind of indulge ourselves in the great sport we call college football. I have my top 25 preseason rankings already, and I'm about to list them out for you. So let's get into the storylines of this great season that we're about to have. New playoff coming out this season. New conference realignment, which is always fun to watch. Every time there's conference realignment, there always seems to be a big major shift in college football in the power standpoint. So let's go right into it. All right, at 25, I have Boise State. That comes as a surprise, probably to a lot of people. Boise State really is kind of trending right back into the right direction with their new head coach from last season, Spencer Danielson, being named. The program wins 3 straight games, wins the conference title, and then after that, they have the best prospect in 2023, Malachi Nelson, transferred from USC over to Boise State to become the new starting quarterback for Boise State. That's a really big upgrade for the Broncos. Also, their recruiting class has trended in the right direction, having the best recruiting class in the conference, in the Mountain West Conference this season. And also, it's the way it's trending right now, it's going to have the best rank in recruiting for that conference, and they're about to crack probably the top 60, which is a great rank for a Mountain West Conference, a group of 5 conference team. So the way I see it, the way the playoff is scheduled, or the way the playoff works out is the best group of 5 team goes in. I think this year it's going to be Boise State. I think they have the best shot at doing it. They have the most talented quarterback there to do that thing. The only other team I really could see is App State. There's no really American team, especially since the American team has been kind of shafted with the new conference realignment, with SMU leaving, with now Cincinnati and UCF gone. And Houston as well. The power struggle in the American has really changed. The conference has changed. So this year, I think the Mountain West really needs to look at taking its next step up and having one of their teams be the premier group of 5 team and being the standard of the group of 5 in college football. Boise State does have a little bit of hardship on their schedule. They do have to play at Oregon, which is one of the best teams of the country. I have them in my top 5. No surprise to anybody. Not spoiling anything. But the rest of their schedule lines up really well. They have to play Washington State and Oregon State, but that's at home. That's really manageable. They have a really manageable schedule. In terms of conference toughness in conference play, they have to play at UNLV, which is the team they played in the Mountain West Championship last year. And other than that, their schedule is really manageable for Boise State. I think they have a really good shot at making the playoff this year. Next up, we have Nebraska. Ooh, this team is interesting because the way I see it last year, if certain events don't occur or they occur differently, Nebraska is 7-5 instead of 5-7. Why is that? They turned the ball over 15 times in total, 13 of them interceptions in the close games that they had. They had a lot of close games last year that they lost. Colorado game, for example, and a lot of more Big Ten West competition. They very close battles. And if you look at how their schedule sets up, they have 8 games in front of the big game on their schedule, Ohio State. where they could be 8-0 going into the horseshoe. Where the only tough game they really have is against Colorado, this time at home. So they could really be 8-0 or 7-1 by the time they get to the Ohio State game and be ranked really high, have a lot of momentum in the program. I really like Matt Rule as a college coach. I never really saw him as a fit in the NFL because just the way he kind of runs his programs. At Baylor, he was really good. He got that program to a Big 12 championship game in 2019. And I think that was like the big pinnacle of his career and also really gets him momentum into going a bigger program like Nebraska. I don't think he should have ever went to the Big Ten, but it was his, or not the Big Ten, but the NFL. I don't think that's necessarily on him. He wanted to try it out. He got an opportunity to get a lot of money and didn't work out. He goes to Nebraska, and now he's got Dylan Raiola, a 5-star quarterback, one of the best players in the recruiting class of 2024. And also he's recruiting very well this season, and also I'm projecting, or a lot of projections are going out to be that he's going to have really good recruiting classes in the future. So I really think this is when Nebraska turns it around. They're going to start going into the right direction. I think I could really realistically see an 8-4 or a 9-3 season from Nebraska. Ceiling about 10-2, 10-1, or 11-1. Floor is about 5-7, what they did last year. This is an interesting team. They're at 23 here. I mean, if their offense is marginally better, I mean, they were the worst offense in college football. And it's not even, it's like, I'm not even trying to overstate. They just were. It was one of the worst offenses we've ever seen. They literally won on punts and field goals. That's it. That's all they won on. And great defense. So they would play the field position game, and they ended up going 10-2 during the regular season. So imagine if their offense was marginally better. Now they get Cade McNamara back, which should be a plus for Iowa. It should be an added bonus in terms of offensive efficiency. Having a consistent quarterback, which Cade McNamara has been known for, just consistent. You know what he is, and you know what he brings to the table. It was the same thing when he was at Michigan. A good run game always helps him, but he can add a little variation to the pass. I think for Iowa, that's going to be big this year. Their defense is returning a lot of starters, and their defense is probably going to still be one of the best defenses in the country like they were last year. And so I think Iowa, their offense is marginally better. Look for them to be in that Big Ten race. The big games they have on their schedule is at the Shoe against Ohio State. And that's about it. They have a couple tough games like Wisconsin. That's always a tough game for Big Ten West teams. At Michigan State, they play Washington at home. But besides that, I think Iowa has a marginal, really, they got it out easy for the schedule they have. They avoid Michigan, they avoid Penn State, they avoid Oregon, which are great teams in the conference. Also USC they avoid. All right, 22 is going to be the Kansas Jayhawks. I really like Jalen Daniels as a quarterback. He's the perfect combination of a dual threat quarterback, especially in the Big 12. I think they have great momentum going into the season. They were 9-4 last year, and I think that trend will continue. I think they could probably reach 10 wins, even after a bowl game. They have a chance to get to the Big 12 title game and maybe make the playoff. I think that's entirely a possibility for Kansas. And the way their schedule sets up, they avoid Utah. They avoid Kansas State. Oh, no, they don't avoid. Excuse me. They avoid Arizona. They avoid Oklahoma State. And I'm pretty sure, I'm trying to think. They avoid Utah as well. I think I already said that, though. Great schedule for them. And I think if they really run the table and they stick true to what they were great at last year, watch out for Kansas. Don't be surprised if they're in the Big 12 championship game and they steal that spot from Kansas State or Oklahoma State. All right, next up, Miami Hurricanes. 21. I refuse to rank them highly in the preseason for the exact reason why Texas A&M is not in the top 25 for me. Because Miami, like Texas A&M, recruits very well. Now, Miami had a great recruiting class last season, and if we look at how their games ended up last season, it was not great for them. They lost a lot of games, which they shouldn't have. Obviously, I'm referring to the Georgia Tech game, which they lost at home in the last few seconds. Should not have happened. Everyone knows that. So games like that, if those go in their favor, I think that they entirely could be 10-2 by the end of the season, losing maybe a game they shouldn't. They have to go to the Swamp, which is going to be a big test to start the season. And then they're at home for Florida State later on. But everything else in between from Florida to Florida State is entirely manageable in terms of the competition in the ACC. They do avoid Clemson, which is really big for them. I don't think they would want to face Clemson, but the only thing is that they have to play Florida State, which is a big one for them. But the added bonus is it's at home, which, I mean, honestly, that should be called a neutral field if you're Miami. Miami fans, be better. I'm just going to say that. Be more passionate. Next up. We got 20. USC. Ooh, it's a lot like Iowa. Flip side, though. If USC's defense is marginally better, if they are at least below average, this offense can to a 9-3 season, maybe even a 10-3 or a 10-2 season. They do have a rougher schedule than most. They do play LSU on a neutral field, and then they play at Michigan at the Big House, and then they play against Penn State at home, albeit, and then they play Nebraska, which for me, I think that's going to be a big game for them when that comes down to it. And then they play at home against Notre Dame. Those are really hard games to play if you are USC. Just looking at the schedule and how things landed last season, you had Caleb Williams and you still went 8-5, 7-5 in the regular season. That's not a great look for Lincoln Riley, and honestly, that defense was atrocious last season. They did not know how to tackle. Gap schemes were terrible, or the way they defended the run, or even the pass. Their secondary was horrible. So it's a lot like Iowa. If their defense is any better, USC could honestly be 9-3, and they could be in the conversation for the college football playoff. It's a lot. They're going to have to depend on Miller Moss being a great quarterback. But then again, Lincoln Riley has been known to take young quarterbacks and take them and really mold the offense around them and make their time easier. In the run-first offense that they have, it's very easy for quarterbacks to kind of blend into his system. I got USC at 20. Next up, 19. I got the Kansas State Wildcats. All right. This is another team where, if I'm going to be honest, the Big 12 is an open race for the second spot. And this is the 4 teams that are in the open race, and Kansas State is one of them, along with Kansas. Kansas State they're losing Will Howard, but honestly, the program is super consistent. Kansas State is a lot like Utah. They know who they are, and they're not going to shy away from it. This is a team that won the Big 12 title 2 years ago, beating TCU. And I think that's very important to note. They are very consistent. Their coach is really good, especially in being consistent taking over Snyder after he retired. Their schedule is moderately hard. They do have to play Arizona, good team last season, Oklahoma State. Then they have to play at Colorado. I still think that would be a tough game at Colorado. They have to play at home against Kansas, and that's really about how hard their schedule gets. But they do have to play three really tough teams in Arizona, Oklahoma State, and Kansas. Really tough schedule. They do avoid Utah. That is a big thing for them. I think if you avoid Utah in your scheduling, that's a big one because Utah is the premier. They have now, and now that they've entered the Big 12, that's the premier program in the Big 12. And that leads me to my 18th best team, Arizona. Noah Fafita and McMillan was one of the best quarterback to wide receiver combinations in the country. And McMillan was an All-American last year. They're coming back. Now, they do lose their coach who went to Washington. So it's a new coach, new regime. But I think they stayed relatively the same. I do think they could go 3, 8-4, or 9-3, maybe 10-2. They do have to play at Rice Eccles Stadium against Utah, and they have to play at Kansas State back to back. But they do have like bye week in between. I think that's a tough way. After that, their schedule gets way easier. They don't have to play very many tough teams after that. So I think it's for them, their schedule gets hard in some parts, but it is separated by a bye week, so that's really helpful for them. For Arizona, it's keeping the same momentum that they had from last year. Last year they finished 12th, which was the highest they've finished in the AP or in any poll since 1998, which is a big thing for the program, especially going into a new conference. And if they get second and they go to the Big 12 title game, that's a big win for the program, especially with their coach going to Washington. That's a big one. Then next up, we got 17, Oklahoma State. Ollie Gordon, obviously going to be in the backfield for Oklahoma State. I think for them, defense might be an issue. It's one of those things where it's have to see it and then wait how their defense is. But I think their offense, very tough-nosed. It's going to be run first, run heavy, and then let the run set up the pass for Oklahoma State. They do have a moderately tough schedule in the middle, and then it gets a little bit more relaxed towards the end. They have Utah at home. That's a big one. And then they have to go on the road to Kansas State. That's a big one for Oklahoma State to play in those 2 weeks. And this one's actually back to back that they have to play Utah and Kansas State. So I think that's a big. Those are two big matchups for Oklahoma State. I very much think their ceiling could be 11-1. I don't know if they're going to go 12-0. 11-1 is a good ceiling. They are in playoff contention. I think we're starting to get into the road of, actually, if I'm going to be honest, every team that I've listed is a playoff contender. Now that we've gotten to from 4 to 12, every team in the top 25 is a playoff contender. Even in the top 30, you're still a playoff contender because the way the playoff works and how seeding goes. So Oklahoma State, I do view as a playoff contender. Their floor for me is 8-4. I do see them. I think they could lose 4 games, and they're scheduled. 16th. This is an interesting team. Clemson. Whew. Ooh. This team went 4-4 in their conference. They finished 20th in the poll, which was a biased. They did win 5 in a row, but I do think it was a biased ranking to put them at 20. Just because the way their program has been declining in the past 3 years since the COVID year. It has not been good since Trevor Lawrence has left. And when DJU took over, not great for Clemson, and then Cade Klubnik came in, he was just not consistent for them. It's for Clemson, and the way Dabo does his dealings at Clemson, at some point you've got to move on to how college football is now. And Dabo has not done that. And he refuses to do that, which is fine. It just means that your program isn't going to be in the playoff or even be in a position to make the playoff and then exceed expectations in the playoff. He has to play at a neutral site against Georgia. Then he has to go against Appalachian State, which is a tough group of 5 team. And then they have to play at Florida State, um, which is going to be a tough game. And it's going to tell us a lot. And honestly, if I'm going to be real, as someone who kind of wants to see Clemson come back, I just don't know. I think they lose a lot of these games in between Florida State and the end of the season. Even if, let's just paint a scenario. If Clemson beats Georgia and then they go to Florida State and they beat them and beat Florida State, I just see them losing a game in between here. I do. That's not me saying things for the like heck of it about Clemson and bashing them. I just think it's true. Clemson is not consistent anymore like they used to be. They are very inconsistent. Um, and I think that's a big thing to look at if you're a Clemson Tigers fan. Dabo's going to stay, but there's no doubt about that. But when it comes to it, he's in a tough position because if he doesn't turn things around soon, there might be some new talks at Clemson. 15th, I've got Oklahoma. They took a really big step last season from the season previous of being 6-7. They went to 10-3. That's a huge step in the right direction for Oklahoma and Brent Venables. I think their defense is a lot better. New quarterback Jackson Arnold comes in after Dylan Gabriel transfers to Oregon. This is a big step up for Oklahoma, and now that their program is going in the right direction, and they're now going into the tough SEC. The one thing about this, though, is they have probably the toughest schedule in the SEC besides Florida. They have to play Tennessee at home. They have to play Texas in the Cotton Bowl. Then they play at Ole Miss, at Missouri, and then Alabama at home, and then at LSU. Holy crap, that is a really tough schedule. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams that are in the coaches poll or my poll in my top 25. Very tough schedule for Oklahoma, but if they split that stretch and they go 3-3, Brent Venables should see this as a win, especially going to a new conference. He should not be expecting to go 10 games, to win 10 games. Maybe he could think that this team has the potential to do that. They do. This team does have the potential to run the table and, let's say, be 11-1. That's their ceiling, I would say. But their floor is 6-6. That is the floor because they play so many tough teams in this schedule. So for Oklahoma, it's a really tough out in terms of their scheduling this year. But if you're Oklahoma and you split that and you go 3-3 or even 4-2 and win 10 games, that bodes really well for Brent Venables and the way the program's trajectory, especially being in the toughest conference in the country. All right, 14th, we got Tennessee. We're starting to get into the SEC team range where this is going to be filled with SEC teams and Big Ten teams. All right, Tennessee. This is a team that I really view as a high ceiling, low floor kind of team where either way, one or the other is going to occur. Nico, the new quarterback, Nico, I'm not even going to try to say the last name, is starting taking over for Joe Milton. This is an interesting team. They do have James Pierce, one of the best players in college football, no doubt about it, on the defensive line. I think this schedule for them works out really well. They do have to play at Norman against Oklahoma. They have to play Alabama at home, which bodes well for them because what happened last time? They played at home. And then they have to play at Georgia. Those are 3 games that are really tough, but if I'm going to be honest, that really bodes well for them that it's only 3 games that you really look at and you're like, okay, those are the really tough games, unlike Oklahoma where they have 6. So for Tennessee, this bodes well for them. Um, I think they have the opportunity to go to the SEC title game. I really, though, see them as the 6th best team in the conference behind the teams I have ahead of them in the poll. All right. At 13, I have Florida State. So for Florida State, this is an interesting. A lot of these programs are interesting, but this is probably the most interesting program in this poll because of what happened last season. Them going undefeated 13-0, getting left out of the playoff, and then they lose to Georgia 63-3, albeit they didn't have a lot of their starters. Neither did Georgia, though. So Florida State, this is interesting to say. I'm not sure they are not better than they were last year. Recruiting stayed about the same. Mike Norvell, I do like him as a head coach. I think what he's doing with this program is exceptional, turning this Florida State program around and bringing them back to glory and where they used to be with James Winston and Jimmo Fisher. They do have to play at home against Clemson, and then they play on the road at Notre Dame and on the road against Miami. Those are 3 really tough games, especially the one at South Bend. That's going to be a really good game to watch for Florida State and Notre Dame. I really view this Florida State team as, can they be the team that sets the tone in the ACC and says, all right, we're the premier team in the ACC. That's what's really going to be at stake here for Florida State and the ACC this season is, with this new conference realignment, who is the standard in that conference? DJU, as I said, is the now starter taking over for Jordan Travis this year. Obviously, key losses is Jordan Travis and Keon Coleman. That 1-2 punch was really big for Florida State last year. All right, at 12, I have LSU, like USC, which ironically they play each other. First game of the season. So LSU and they do lose the Heisman Trophy winner in Jaden Daniels. Their defense was horrible last year. It was really bad. And when it comes down to it, I think it's Garrett Nussmeier at quarterback for LSU this season. I think with Brian Kelly, he is a very consistent coach. You know what you're getting out of him. And I think this season it's going to stay the same. I think LSU they'll be in the conversation for being in the playoff. No doubt about it. Even if they're 9-3, because they play against USC on a neutral field, they play Ole Miss, and they play Alabama. They even play Texas A&M on the road, which will be a hard game to play. And then they play Oklahoma at home. So their schedule kind of lines up fine for them. They only have to go on the road 4 times this season, if you don't count the neutral game as the road game. So they really have 7 home games, which bodes extremely well for LSU. That's really big for them because you take the pressure of going on the road and you just eliminate it. Literally eliminate it. And the only 4 teams that they have to play on the road is South Carolina, Arkansas, Texas A&M, and Florida. I mean, by the time they get to Florida, which will be late in the season, Florida will be beaten up because they played so many great teams. For LSU, I think if their defense just gets moderately better, which under Brian Kelly, I'm not really worried about. With USC and Lincoln Riley, I'm extremely worried about that defense and how that is going to look this season. With Brian Kelly, I think he's a great coach in terms of being a balanced team. He showed that at Notre Dame, that they were a balanced team pretty much every season. I don't think that's going to be a question if the defense is going to be better. I think he's going to address it this season. All right, at 11, I've got the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. A lot of people are like really highly ranking Notre Dame this season, and for good reason. They are getting Riley Leonard, transfer from Duke this season, or from Duke last season, and that's really big for the program. They go from Sam Hartman to Riley Leonard. I think season really could be the season Notre Dame goes to the playoff, especially if they go 12-0. They start the season off with playing at Texas A&M, which will be a really big game and a really interesting game to see how it's up for Notre Dame. And then in between, from the time they play Texas A&M to Florida State, which is in a 7-game stretch, they play nobody. Literally nobody is on their schedule. For Notre Dame, it will be interesting to see. I think for Marcus Freeman, this is the season where he hangs his hat and is like, this is what I built my program for the season for Notre Dame. I think this is a big season for him to showcase what he's been building at Notre Dame. All right. At 10, we have Penn State Nittany Lions. Whew. So for Penn State, they avoid a lot of really hard teams like Michigan, like Oregon. They don't avoid Ohio State, though, but they get them at home, which really bodes well. Their schedule has to be by far one of the easiest. They do also have to play at USC, though. Forgot to say that. Um, this is a really easy schedule comparatively to the other schedules that were kind of lower, the teams that were lower on the top 25. For Penn State this season, really it's about the Ohio State game. If they can win that game, then they go to the Big Ten title. What could happen there? For Penn State, it is a what can happen if they truly win, get that big win against Ohio State, because in years previous, they haven't beat Ohio State since the fabled 2016 year where Saquon Barkley and Trace McSorley were there. That's a big hole in James Franklin's kind of resume, is he can't win the big one. He only won the big one when he had to, when he was building a program and establishing Penn State on the map. For Penn State this year, it is, can they beat Ohio State and get that bye? Because if you're Penn State, you want to establish yourself in the Big Ten. This is for every conference that's getting realignment, is can you establish yourself as one of the best teams in the conference and establish yourself as a standard. This is going to be a benchmark year that we're going to be looking at for years to come. We're going to be like, this is the new standard for college football. And for Penn State, with Drew Allard, Nick Singleton coming back, and with a new offensive coordinator for Penn State, they've got to establish a more explosive passing game. It was way too predictable last year, which is why you saw a 20-12 matchup against Ohio State. It was very conservative play calling for Penn State. It was easily predictable, easily understandable, and at that point they were down 20-6 in the fourth quarter. That last touchdown was really a consolation prize for Penn State. Really important year for Penn State this season. Another really important year for another program, Michigan. They lose Jim Harbaugh to the NFL. Sharon Moore comes in as head coach. There's a lot of negative connotation towards the program because of all the allegations against the program. And the comments that Jim Harbaugh made did not help the program whatsoever from the investigation standpoint. And with that being said, a lot of changes in Ann Arbor this season. New quarterback, completely new offensive, just offensive leadership from the standpoint of Michigan is at. A lot of transfers went out, except for Donovan Edwards. The defense is still really strong. They still have Will Johnson at cornerback, and their front seven estate. Their defense is going to be rock solid. It's just the offense is the big question, and Alex Orji at quarterback. They're going to be able to run the football, but can they balance it with the pass? That's always been like the question with Michigan, and J.J. McCarthy kind of solved those issues with Michigan. This season, it's the same. They need to make sure that they stay balanced enough. They do have a really rough schedule. They avoid Penn State, but they have to play Texas, USC, at Washington, Oregon, and then at Ohio State for the game. If they can be, let's say, 9-2 by the time they get to the game, that's big. And for Michigan, it will be big if they win 4 in a row against Ohio State, because even if they are 8-3 going into that game, they will still have that over Ohio State. And if you think about it, are you going to leave a 9-3 program or 9-3 Michigan team out of the playoff? No, you're not. A team that beat Ohio State, that is the most talented roster in the country, you're not going to leave them out. So from the Michigan perspective, again, it's all about the game at the end of the season. Team at the 8th spot, I've got Missouri. This team was really good last season, and it really showed themselves at what they could be this season. With Luther Burden and Brady Cook coming back, this stage for Missouri to kind of sneak into the SEC title game, because what could happen is all these teams beat each other out and they kind of sneak in. And if you look at the schedule for Missouri, their notable games are at Texas A&M, at Alabama, and versus Oklahoma. If they only lose one of those 3 games and then they win the rest of their games, we might be seeing a Missouri team in the SEC title game and also be in the playoff. I honestly could see that. I see them as a surefire playoff contender and also kind of a team that will probably have a very high chance of making the playoff, higher than Oklahoma, higher than LSU, and higher than Tennessee. I view them in the more upper echelon of the SEC at the moment. At 7, I kind of view this program as the model of consistency out west. This is the Utah Utes. This is extremely consistent when it comes down to Kyle Whittingham. Now, he is looking to retire, and his replacement is setting himself up. This may be the last year Kyle Whittingham is the head coach for Utah. But with Cam Rising coming back, this team is going to be set up to be in the playoff. This is actually, it is the best roster in the Big 12, and it's not really close. The defense is so strong, like it is every year. And with Cam Rising coming back, he just he adds another level of dynamic ability to the offense. And so it adds a lot for the Utah Utes this season. The notable games that they have to play at Oklahoma State, always rough to play there. And then they have they're at home against Arizona. Really tough games, and they're back to back. But if Utah can survive that, they're like smooth sailing after that until the Big 12 title game. All right. At 6th, I've got Ole Miss. Ole Miss is a interesting team from the standpoint of they got a lot out of the transfer portal this season. They won the transfer portal by far. It was not really close when it comes down to it. And then their schedule this season really, I mean, it's half and half for them. They do avoid Alabama, but they do have to go at LSU. They do have to play at home against Oklahoma, and then they play at home against Georgia. 3 notable games for Ole Miss, and the way their schedule sets up. I think first part of their schedule is super easy. They play a bunch of cupcake teams, which they can be able to get past, and then when they play LSU, that will be the kind of the benchmark game for Ole Miss. They do get Jackson Dart back. They do lose Quinshon Judkins, but that running game and Lane Kiffin being the offensive scheme or offensive guy that he is, I think he can really rebuild that for Ole Miss and make it really effective for Ole Miss, especially with how talented his roster is. This is the season for Ole Miss to really kind of turn it around from being kind of a team that kind of just falters and loses the big game and doesn't really like step up when they need it to. This is the season that they got to do it. All right, 5th. I did debate on putting this team lower, but then I realized that would be very foolish of me because a lot of people would do this. They're probably going to, is they're going to put Alabama at the 9 or 10 spot after losing Nick Saban. I don't see it this way. They are going to make the playoff. I don't really care what anybody else says. They're going to. Even with how tough their schedule is, they do have to play Georgia. They do have to play at Tennessee. They do have to play Missouri and at LSU and at Oklahoma. And then they have to play Auburn, which is always a rough game according to what we saw last year. That was a really fun game. But if you're Alabama, Kalen DeBoer is the key. And the thing that they got out of Kalen DeBoer is a winner, which is exactly what Nick Saban was. Kalen DeBoer has probably the highest winning percentage out of any coach in college football, aside from probably Ryan Day and Kirby Smart. He is the definition of a winner. Everywhere he goes, he wins. And I think if you're Alabama, that was a home run hire for the Crimson Tide. I think it's this will be very interesting. They are still crushing it in recruiting, which is why I'm really skeptical on why people are putting Alabama so low in terms of the SEC and where their standing is now that Nick Saban's gone. I do think there will be a step back, but it won't be as big as what people will think it is. Nick Saban is a big person for the program of Alabama, but when you look at what Kalen DeBoer has done this offseason, they're still first in recruiting, or they're still in the top 5 of recruiting every year, and transfer portal did kind of hurt them, but then he got it back through recruiting. Big for Alabama. I still have them at 5th. I still have them making the playoff because nothing changes. All right, at 4, this is really the top 4 here is pick your poison at where you want to rank them. Everyone has the same top 4. And I don't really think there's much of a debate about this. At 4, I've got Oregon, though. Oregon is... Dan Lanning is crushing it. I mean, going from... He has probably the most talented team out west. He's building a really great... He just got the transfer of Dylan Gabriel and Tez Johnson. Those two are huge. And their defense is going to be great. I think a lot of teams in the Big Ten are going to realize how tough and how physical Oregon is. They're not going to be able to push them around like they think they would, like with a USC or even a Washington, because that's what happened against Michigan in the national title game. For Oregon, it is very imperative that you beat Ohio State and Eugene. If they win that game, there's a clear path to the Big Ten title game and to the playoff and getting a high seed. This is really the season where Dan Lanning really should make that turn. This is, as I said, there are a lot of conferences where it's a lot of conference realignment, and there's a lot of opportunity to change the way your program is viewed in the conference. So this is a season where Oregon needs to set the standard for themselves. I think Dylan Gabriel fits better at Oregon for what they do in that offense. I think Dylan Gabriel is a lot like Bo Nix, where he gets it out to everyone. He gets the short passes to set up easier second and third downs. And I think for Oregon, that's really big to get Dylan Gabriel because he's more along the lines of that quarterback. They do have to play at the Big House as well against Michigan. But I think besides that, they're smooth sailing in terms of scheduling. All right, number 3, I've got Texas. Steve Sarkisian has really turned that team around in Austin, and I don't really think it's close. This team is really good. They did make a playoff last year, their first playoff ever. Let's let that sink in after the many years of Texas saying they're back. All right, I'll let that sink in for extra. But for Texas, it's a lot like the Oregon schedule. They do have to play at Michigan, and then they play against Georgia at home. That's a big benchmark game for them. That's a game they can. Now, the thing is for Texas is what's important here is when you look at the schedule, they have to play against Oklahoma before they get to Georgia, which is very important here. They do have to play Oklahoma on a Sunday, which leaves for less room to recover for Georgia. So, with the emotions running high at Texas, especially what happened last year at the Cotton Bowl, where Oklahoma wins on that last second touchdown, a lot of emotions are going to be into this game. And we could see a scenario where they beat Oklahoma, they're relieved, they're like, oh my gosh, we did it. We beat Oklahoma after what happened last season. And that was the one blemish on our regular season schedule. And then they have to go against Georgia. That's a really rough turnaround where you have to play one of the best teams in the country. And so it will really set the stage of what this Texas team is really about. Besides those two games, I'm really seeing Texas as a really solid team. Their floor is 9-3. I want to reiterate that. That's their floor. Their ceiling is 12-0. That's their ceiling. They're that good. I think they need to address. I think they addressed the problems of the secondary last year because that's what Washington beat them with last season. They do have problems in the front seven. A lot of them went to the NFL or transferred out. So that's really big for Texas to address. Another thing, C.J. Baxter is out for the season. That was news that came out last week. That's huge for Texas. That was crushing for Texas. I know for Steve Sarkisian, he did not expect that, obviously. And for them to really balance Quinn Ewers coming back and balance the run and the pass, because that's what they did so well last year on offense. But Texas, I think, is a surefire. We're getting into the conversation of they're going to be in the playoff. Doesn't really matter if they're a 3-loss or a 2-loss team. They're going to be in the playoff. All right, number 2. So the top 2 is really a toss-up, but I'm going to go with Georgia at 2. And here's why. Kirby Smart is probably the best coach in college football. And ever since Nick Saban retired, I don't think there's much of a debate to that. If you're Georgia, you recruit super well. The thing is, they have to be back in the playoff, and they have to set their mark on the playoff. Last year, they didn't make the playoff. That's actually really big if you think about it in terms of what Georgia needs to prove this year, because they were the 2-time reigning national champions. And for Georgia, you're really you're trying to set the stage in the SEC of you are the standard. And you don't want Texas to come in and be like, well, we are the standard now, or even Ole Miss. And you definitely don't want Alabama to feel, oh yeah, we still have Georgia, because last time I checked, Alabama beat Georgia. And guess what? Georgia has to go on the road to Tuscaloosa to play Alabama and Bryant-Denny. That's their big game. That's the game they got to win, because that's a lot of at stake for Georgia to establish that they're still the best, that they are the best team in the conference, and it's not up for conversation. And they do have to play at Texas. They have a really rough schedule. Their floor, honestly, is 9-3, because they could lose at Alabama, they can lose at Texas, and they could lose at Ole Miss. That's a really rough schedule, and their floor is low, 9-3, and their ceiling is 12-0, obviously. All right, at first, I have Ohio State, most talented roster in the country, and comparatively to Georgia, Ohio State won the offseason. Getting Quinshon Judkins, Caleb Downs in the back end for the defense, and getting Will Howard at quarterback to replace Kyle McCord. Kyle McCord did not work out at Ohio State. You want to know why? Because they lost against Michigan. There were so many times where you realize that if they had C.J. Stroud, they would win that Michigan game because of how close it was. If you look at the 7:30 mark of that Michigan game, Kyle McCord throws an interception that really wasn't even open. He throws a slant to Marvin Harrison Jr., and Will Johnson just literally bully balls it. And you could tell it wasn't really open. So you're like, well, what was the decision making on that throw? Will Howard, I believe, comes in and changes the perspective of the quarterback play. Big games they have to play. Their most benchmark game The biggest game of the season for them is at Oregon at Eugene. That will show us a lot. That is going to be one of the bigger games in the season. Now, that's their benchmark game. But there is another level. They have to beat Michigan, especially this season, with Jim Harbaugh leaving, with everything surrounding the Michigan program, with all the transfers coming out of Michigan, and a new face in Sharon Moore at Michigan. If you're Ryan Day and you lose to Michigan 4 times in a row, how does that look for you? Let's be honest. The game. You're at home this time. The 3 that they've lost in a row were on the road. 2 of them were on the road, 1 at home. This is a big look for Ohio State and Ryan Day, because if he loses this game against this Michigan team, we're going to be looking at Ohio State and Ryan Day as maybe we need a little switch up here. And that's a fair assessment. If we're going to be honest, it is a very fair assessment. So it is a big game for Ryan Day to look at. That is the X on their schedule. Like everything else, if they lose against Oregon, you can kind of regroup on that game. And this is the game that you have to hang your hat on. It doesn't really matter. Big Ten title game doesn't matter. Even if you miss that game. If you beat Michigan, that is the big one. Because you can't let them beat you 4 times in a row. That is the one blemish on Ryan Day's resume. And that's the only blemish that is needed to fire you at Ohio State. So for Ohio State, with this big recruiting class, with this big transfer portal class, and how they're set up like roster-wise, they are the best roster in college football. Not even really close. Georgia is second. It's very important that they beat Michigan this season. I'm going to say it multiple times during the season. The amount of times I do recordings of the show, I will say it. Ohio State doesn't matter as long as they beat Michigan. And once we get into Thanksgiving weekend, I will keep saying it. Anyway. All right, that's my top 25. Any issues? I don't really see many issues. I could see some issues, like maybe having Tennessee a little too high or Miami a little too low. I understand Miami, a lot of people are going to say, put them at 12 or 13, 14 range. I'm not going to be quick because a lot of people did this with Texas A&M where they got the number 1 recruiting class and like, oh, let's put them in the top 25 already, where they don't have a model of consistency. So I think it's important that Miami kind of establishes consistency with Mario Cristobal at head coach. Another thing is Boise State being in there. I could see how that being a little bit controversial because what has Boise State proven in the past years? I mean, they won the conference title. That's about it. So anyway, that's my top 25. This is the first episode of the show. Yeah. So I'll try to have it be weekly until we get to the college football season, and then I'll have weekly recap shows where I go through all the games and stuff, and I talk about them. Anyway, coolio. Give me the lights, give me